We are going to be talking about the concept of positioning. This continues with our discussion about page layout using CSS. In the previous couple of class sessions, we were talking about floats and how we can use that to move items to the left and right on our page and alter the document flow. We have another option, and it's called positioning. And what positioning allows us to do is it allows us to be a bit more specific about where we place items on the page. So if we remember, let's go back to the starter file that we used. So let's go back to my Dreamweaver file. This is the starter file that you had added some styles to at the beginning of the first floating exercise. I've created these files, cleaned them all up, and they are available for you to download so that we can all start in the same place again. This is where we're going to take a look and do a comparison between floating and positioning. In this case, I'm just going to go into box 1 and I'm going to add a float. And I'm going to do a float right. I'm going to save that, and then let's go take a look in our browser. So here is our file. I'm just going to refresh that. And if you recall, when you float something, you're moving it outside of the normal document flow. So it's moved over all the way over to the right, and box 2 has taken its place and moved up and filled in that gap. This is about the amount of control that we have with floating left and right. We can just move it in and out of the flow to the left or the right of the normal flow. And if we move this page in, box 1 continues to move with this far outer right edge. And it'll eventually go over the green box, box 2, and start pushing it out of the way, saying, no, I have precedence of flow here, but box 2 doesn't want to go away. So it keeps moving along. Before we take a look at what positioning does, let's look at a few definitions that'll help us understand what is happening when we start changing things. So here is, in a really basic way, the comparison between floats and positioning. As you could see, floats interact with and are affected by other elements on the page. And that was what a couple class sessions ago where you first were introduced to floats and you were moving those boxes around on the page. You saw how they interacted with each other, that if you floated one left and a different one right, the boxes would shift around and fill in spaces. So they're interacting with each other. By contrast, positioning allows us to place an element in a very specific location no matter how the document object model changes. And document object model it's an important term, but we're not going to go into it in real depth here. But think about it as your document flow, and I'll show you what I mean. This image gives us an idea of what the document object model is. And really what it does is it's just the framework of your website in breaking down the code so we can see how all of the pieces relate to each other. So in this particular example, we're looking at the document. So this would be your HTML file. Inside of that, of course, we have the opening HTML tags. And within that, we have some elements which are the head and the body. You'll notice on this document that they are actually in two separate branches off of this tree because the head goes in one way and it controls the metadata, the stuff that we can't see on the page. For example, the title. Then the other element that we see here is the body. And of course, that is what we see. And that's the stuff that we've been working really hard at getting our pages to do what we want them to do. And inside the body, you can see that we have other elements such as our H1s, our hrefs. This is where we also have all the semantic markup. So we have our header, we have our nav, our main. If we're using them, we also would have our section and our asides, and then our footers, as well as all of the elements that take to make up our page, such as those H1s, paragraphs, etc., etc. But what the document object model, or DOM, is doing, it's showing us the relationship. So for example, the head is a child of the HTML tag. So we could say then that the HTML tag is its immediate ancestor. It is its predecessor in this. With body, HTML is also its immediate ancestor. So then if we look at body, inside of it we have, again, we have our H1s, we have our headers, those sorts of things. In this specific example, H1 is the child of body, and body is H1's immediate ancestor. This will all make sense in a moment, or hopefully it'll make more sense anyway. So that is in essence what the document object model is. So if you want to go take a look, you can look it up more by Googling it. This is actually an image that's pulled from Wikipedia, which has a pretty good explanation. If you want to learn more about what the document object model is, the book does talk about it some. What you really need to take away from this is that how this relationship, because this is your document flow that we keep talking about. So now we're back at the description that I had provided of the difference between floats and positioning. So as we said, floats interact and are affected by each other. Positioning is allowing us to pin or place that element on a page. Well, there are three different types of positioning that we are going to be focusing on. There is absolute, relative, and fixed. And the first one that we're going to look at is absolute. And what absolute allows us to do is to position an element on a page, so such as your H1 or an image, or in the case of this exercise, a box 1 ID style. And it will position it relative to the nearest positioned, that's the key here, positioned ancestor. So if you remember with floats, when we'd float something, it was still relative to something else that was floated. So that was its own form of positioning. So it's going to, in this case, absolute positioning is going to position itself relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. And if there is no ancestor that has positioning applied to it, it will position itself absolutely relative to the document body, which is just a fancy way of saying relative to the body tags. So our opening and closing body tags, which is generally speaking going to be just the outer edges of our browser screen. Now let's go take a look and see what this means. We're back in our code and we have floated box 1 to the right. Now instead we want to do some positioning. In this case I'm going to remove float and I'm going to go in and we're going to use the word position and we're going to use absolute because this is what we're working on, is absolute positioning. But absolute positioning doesn't in and of itself do anything. Well, okay, it does do something because if we save this, let's go out to our browser. You can see that it has retained its spot up in the upper left, but our box 2 appears to have disappeared. It really hasn't disappeared. It's actually behind box 1 because technically by applying that position of absolute to box 1, we've moved it outside of the actual flow of our document, so box 2 moved into its place and it's hiding underneath here. So with absolute positioning, we actually need to apply some more elements, more properties to this. So let's go back to our CSS and take care of that. We have 4 different properties that we can apply. We have top, left, right, and bottom. So what we are doing is we are positioning things at a certain distance from either the top or from the left or from the right, or from the bottom. And it all, which ones you use kind of depends on where you want to put the element on the page. So in this case, let's go in and position this from the left. And when I say left, what it's doing is it's going to position it from the left-hand side, and it's going to count out how many pixels, and then the left edge of the element will place itself at that mark that I have assigned it. So we're going to do left, and I'm going to say 400 pixels. I'm doing 400 pixels because I know that these boxes are 300 pixels. So that means that our box 1 should move about 100 pixels over and sit outside over here. So I'm going to just hit save. So we can see there's box 2. It had moved up into the normal document flow because we haven't applied floats or position to box 2, 3, or 4. And so here is our box 1. It hasn't moved anywhere in relation to the main, which is the big blue box here that it's in, but we did tell it to go out from the left, so from this side, out 400 pixels. So that's why it is where it is. Now what if we change the top? So we're going to go in and we're going to say we want it to be down 50 pixels from the top. So think about our definition. An element that uses absolute positioning is going to be positioned relative to its nearest positioned ancestor. Do we have a positioned ancestor? No. In this case, we're saying if an absolute positioned element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the document body. So where do we think when we say that we are putting this 50 pixels down from the top, where is that going to place that box? Let's go take a look. And there it is. It's 50 pixels down from the top and 400 from the left. And you'll see that it is out of that document flow. And we haven't positioned anything else on this document, so it positions itself to the body, which is right up here. So it says, nope, here's 50 pixels. And it's still 400 from the left. So this is how we can position certain elements in ways that we want. What if we don't want it 50 pixels from the top of the page, but we want it 50 pixels from the top of this main? Before we apply that positioning to the main element, let's go look at what the definition of our second type of positioning is, which is relative positioning. Relative positioning keeps the element within its normal document flow. This is the difference between relative and absolute. As you saw, absolute, if it moved, such as box 1, it moved out of the document flow, and box 2 moved up into its place. However, if we use relative positioning, it keeps that space and doesn't allow anything to move into it, but it still will move the item however many pixels out of the way. Let's go take a look at what this means. So before we go and change the main and add positioning to that, let's look at what the difference between absolute and relative is as we apply it to box 1. So I'm going to change this position absolute to position relative. Okay, let's go take a look in our browser. Let's hit refresh. It has kept this within the normal document flow. So if you remember, box 1 is inside of main, which is this big blue box. This is its normal space because we've said it's 100 pixels high by 300 pixels wide. So this is its normal space, but now we've shifted it out of its flow, and so it's 400 over from the left and 50 down from the top relative to the main or its ancestors. So it still is keeping everything within the flow. Let's go back and make our box 1 absolute. Save it. We'll take a quick peek just to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to. So there it is. It's 50 and it's 400. Box 2 has moved up into its position in the flow of the document. And now let's go apply relative positioning to the main, because if you remember, absolute positioning will be absolute to its nearest positioned ancestor. So we're going to position an ancestor. Let's go back. And I happen to know that there is no main style. It does exist, like for example, here, part of style groups, but it isn't on its own. So I'm just going to go, let's see, right above box 1 so it's easy to see. And we're going to create a style for main. We'll just open and close that. Inside of this, now we're going to do position. And we're just going to assign this relative. What we're doing here, because we're not going to say left, right, top, or bottom, we're just going to say, no, relative. In other words, keep this within the document flow. Don't really change a thing, but now we've applied this positioning to it. So it's a positioned ancestor to box 1. So here's box 1. And if we look at the HTML, there's main, and then there's there is our box 1 div. And so this is the child to main. Main is its ancestor. Main has now been given a position. And so box 1, which is also positioned, will position itself absolutely to its closest ancestor, which will be main. So we need to save this. And now let's go take a look in our browser and see what happens. Okay, here we are before I hit refresh. So we are 50 pixels down from the body element because there is no positioning, and we're 400 from the left-hand side for the body element. If we hit refresh, notice how it shifted, because now we're 50 pixels relative to the top of the main div. Box 2 is still in its normal flow, but now we're not overlapping up into this positioning exercise header because we've positioned the main as relative. So that's the difference between and how we use relative and absolute. We're going to do in the lab for this week is you're going to get a lot more practice with this. And before I finish, I just want to show you one more of the positioning styles that we work with, which is called fixed. And let's go take a look at a definition of what this means. So our third and final element when it comes to positioning, fixed, means that whatever we have applied fixed to, it is going to stay in that exact location relative to the viewport. It doesn't move even when you're scrolling the page. So let's go take a look at what that means so you can see the difference between what is fixed and what is absolute. Because absolute will still scroll along with the page, but fixed is going to stay put. And so even if you scroll along, it's not going to move. Let's go back to our code, and I'm going to go into box 1, and we are going to change this position from absolute to fixed. I'm going to, just for the sake of this demonstration, we're going to go and remove, I'm actually just going to comment out, and here's in Dreamweaver, if you haven't found it, here's the shortcut for commenting out code in our CSS. So this is not going to be seen anymore. So our main is no longer going to have any positioning. So remember, this is going to go 50 pixels from the top of our page again. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to refresh this. Now this doesn't look any different than when we did the absolute positioning. The difference is, though, when we did our absolute positioning, if we needed to scroll on our page, it would move along with the page. And since our content is really short here, let me just shorten up my page here a bit. And if we scroll, watch what happens with the positioning exercise and the boxes on the far left. But notice box 1, the red box, it stays right where it is. It does not move. Let's go back and just change this in our CSS to absolute so you can see the difference. So we're going to go absolute, save, and come back over and refresh. So it doesn't look any different, but now watch what happens when we scroll. So with absolute positioning, you can see box 1 goes along with everything else, and it moves along with that page. And so it scrolls off the top of that page. Let's go back. Change this to fixed, save, refresh, and now it's going to stay regardless of where I'm scrolling in the page. It's always going to be 50 pixels down and 400 pixels over. So that is the gist of positioning. So then next up is going through the lab for the week, and I hope that that will help you understand where and how we can use positioning on a page, because you will see that there are floats built into the code on that lab. You will be adding positioning as well, so the two will work together to accomplish certain design and layout goals. Thank you.